Good afternoon. My name is Jason Killeen, and I'm an Assistant Executive Director with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. And today is October 23rd, 2024, and we're going to go ahead and get started with the Q&A virtual lunch hour. Next slide. I just want to do a quick reminder for applicants, licensees, and other folks engaged in commercial cannabis activity or supporting those businesses that we are in the 2025 license renewal period. Our regular renewal period opened at the beginning of September, and it will close on November 1st of 2024. So if you haven't already submitted a renewal record for your pending application, temporary approval, or annual license, it's important to make sure you do that as soon as possible and then pay the applicable fees by the November 1st deadline, or you may be subject to additional late fees. After November 1st, we do have our first late renewal period, which will run from November 2nd through the end of the calendar year. There are additional fees that are assessed on late renewals submitted. And then the last renewal period begins January 1st through of 2025 through February 28th of 2025. And additional late fees will be assessed on those records. All licenses and records expire after December 31st, 2024. So if you have not timely renewed before the end of the calendar year, your record will either close and have to be refiled, or you will have to cease operations, your record will close, and you will have to refile and go through that process before you can be issued a new license. So it's very important that folks that do have the ability to operate make sure that they get their renewals in a timely manner and pay applicable fees so that they don't lose the ability to operate. Next slide, please. The department has sent out a couple of renewal reminders as well as application and license fee reminders. The two different invoice types have different due dates. So all renewal fees, whether it's the 1829 for a record renewal, the 4233 for temporary approval, or 8486 for an annual license, are due on or before Friday, November 1st of 2024, and that is due for each activity. Separately, businesses have been invoiced for the deferred annual license application fees of $7,691 per activity, and those are due based on the dates specified on your annual license application invoice. For folks that have not been deemed complete and gone through the commission yet, the director wanted to make sure that in addition to the basic 30 days that applicants get to pay the fees, they would have up to an additional 60 days for a final deferral. But all of these annual license application fees are due before the end of the calendar year. And of course, the application fees plus the renewal fees do have to be paid for the business to be in good standing with DCR and be eligible to renew their record for calendar year 2025. We are working with Excella, who is our consultant, to see if we can differentiate the fees by invoice type, because currently all outstanding fees will appear on an invoice anytime a new invoice gets generated. And I know that that's led to some confusion for folks that were invoiced for annual license application fees and may have had a due date in December and then submitted a renewal. And then the renewal has, of course, the due date of November 1st for those renewal fees. The renewal fees do have to be paid by November 1st. And then, of course, the annual license application fees have to be paid by whatever due date was on your annual license application invoice. As I mentioned, our communications team did put together a communication that went out earlier this week, providing additional information about how to review the invoices and what fees are due for each particular invoice type. And of course, if that didn't provide enough clarification, there's additional information on the DCR website, and you can always email us at dcrlicensing@lacity.org to get your questions addressed. Next slide. I think we went one slide too far, but we can go ahead and get started with the Q&A.
Good afternoon. Our first question comes from Lennon V. Is there one place on the DCR website to gain information about all permits, licenses, and requirements that are needed to start a cannabis business?
The simple answer is no. The website itself is kind of the one-stop shop for DCR related information. So there's a couple different places where you can start. One of them is the legal tab, which has links to the municipal code section that relates to commercial cannabis activity. It's also got links to the rules and regulations. That basically outlines the overarching law and rules that businesses have to follow. Separately, we have under licensing and applications and resources section where you can find out more information about the different commercial cannabis activity types, what needs to be submitted for those applications, and some helpful videos and information about how to prepare. We also have our application forms and documents. Those are the things that you're going to have to prepare and submit as part of your application submittal. And then, of course, depending on the type of commercial cannabis activity you plan to get engaged in and the location that you're seeking to engage at, you may have to pull building for permits, fire permits, permits with the Bureau of Sanitation. All commercial cannabis businesses do have to get a public health permit for each of their activities. So you will have to apply for those health permits with LA County before you're eligible to get an operating permit. So the website itself is the best place to go for DCR related information, and it's broken down into different sections. And then, of course, for any permits or information that you may need from other agencies, it's best for you to reach out directly to those agencies because DCR can't speak to those permitting requirements.
Follow-up question from Lennon. Is an industrial wastewater permit from the City of Los Angeles sanitation required for my business?
It may be. It depends on the application and the activities that you're engaged with. Again, the Los Angeles Department of Public Works Bureau of Sanitation is the department responsible for dealing with industrial waste. So it's best for you to reach out directly to the Industrial Waste Management Division within the Bureau of Sanitation to determine whether or not one of their permits would be required for your commercial cannabis activity. They do have on their website information for how to connect with them or to reach out to find out more information. And if a member of our team could go ahead and drop that link into the Zoom chat, that would be helpful.
Thank you, Jason. The next question comes from initials AS. When will CEQA inspections be available for cultivation?
So the city doesn't have a CEQA inspection. We have a few different types of inspections. There's an initial inspection, which is required to get temporary approval. There's a compliance inspection, which is required of any business that has a license. They're supposed to go through a compliance inspection on an annual basis. And then the city has a final inspection where the applicant or licensee has to demonstrate that they've met all of the necessary permitting requirements, including the certificate of occupancy, the public health permits, their state licenses, and then pass that inspection in order to get a operating permit. If the question was related to getting a notice of complete application and then having DCR make a recommendation on the issuance of an annual license application, we are processing those non-retail records on a rolling basis based on when the state provisional license would expire. Payment of annual license application fees and all other applicable environmental fees would be necessary to get to that notice of complete application. And that will drive the timing for when your record is complete, when the final environmental report, which may be a notice of exemption, is prepared, and then when the city would be in a position to adopt those findings. Just like we've done for the retail storefront, For folks that are facing a January or February deadline, we are working on those records currently so we can have them processed before the end of the calendar year. And if you don't have a provisional expiring early next year, the payment of your fees is going to drive how quickly you get into the queue.
Next question from Maurice C. I need more information on the timing of notice of exemptions for non-retail licenses. When will non-retail licenses begin to receive NOEs?
As a general matter, businesses that do not engage in the retail storefront activity, the things that have to go to the Cannabis Regulation Commission, the purely non-storefront delivery, which is the Type 9 license, and the non-retail activities, folks that have a state provisional expiring in January will start to see their annual license application determinations in November. Folks that have provisional licenses expiring in February will start to see their annual license determinations in December. And then based on those provisional expiration dates, other applications will be done on a rolling basis.
Question from Diana E. Are there any additional documents that need to be submitted to get a notice of exemption for a non-retail license?
That, of course, is always going to be driven by the application record and whether or not the analyst has, sent an email asking for additional information. For phase one businesses, the basic documents required to get to a complete annual license application are sufficient. For phase two applicants, whether you're a tier one, tier two applicant that has to go through the equity share review, you'll have to have completed the equity share review for your phase two application to be deemed complete. If you're a tier three applicant, you'll have to have submitted your social equity attestation, which is available on the DCR website if you haven't already, in order for your application to be deemed complete. So some applicants may have to submit additional documentation for their application to be deemed complete, but that's really going to be phase-based. It's best to reach out directly to your analyst to see if you have any missing documentation and what else will need to be submitted, in addition to paying the outstanding annual license application fees and other fees to get to that notice of complete application.
Our next question comes from Mickey's G. When is DCR planning to submit the report to City Council to change the social equity individual applicant criteria and to open up the cultivation license process?
A report is forthcoming. I've seen a near final draft, and I think within the next 2 weeks, it'll probably be transmitted to City Council.
And then a follow-up from Mickey's. Is DCR planning to offer cultivation licenses through the PCN process as well?
That'll be a policy matter. The public convenience or necessity process is driven by a council resolution. The council resolved to allow for public convenience or necessity findings for the Type 10, which is the retail storefront activity. If the council would like to consider PCN requests for the cultivation activity, they'll have to issue and adopt a new resolution that outlines the criteria for how an applicant can demonstrate that a cultivation license would serve a public convenience or necessity. And that would be a future council action. At this time, because there's not a resolution in place to facilitate a PCN finding for cultivation, even if we were to accept applications in areas that are unduly concentrated, there's no way for that pre-app record to actually move through the process because you would not be able to get the finding necessary for DCR to process your annual license application. That is on the docket for folks to consider at some point in 2025. But there are some deadline-driven dates that are more pressing that need to be addressed first before we start to work with the council to try to figure out what a cultivation PCN process would look like.
Ariella J asks, why has DCR issued an annual application invoice for previously abandoned records? Are these fees required for abandoned records?
Great question. So any application that DCR has worked on or started to process, including those ones that were abandoned, were only worked on because we deferred the initial fees so that we could begin working on the record. The fact that the record got abandoned doesn't relieve the applicant from having to pay those fees. So those fees are going to sit on the record. If the record is abandoned and the balance is still outstanding, the city has a process by which bad debt gets written off and then applicants get sent to collections. So any of those abandoned records that have balances due, if not resolved, will at some point be written off as bad debt and forwarded to collections. That process is handled by the city's Office of Finance. As folks that may be interested in refiling know, an abandoned record is only eligible to be refiled if it was deemed filed in the first place, which includes the submission of the documents and the payment of the fees. So any of those records, those abandoned records that have a balance, if that balance is not cleared, that record will never be eligible for refiling. So depending on what the applicant plans to do, those annual license application fees do need to be paid, or they risk not being able to refile, and they further risk having the fees written off as bad debt and being sent to collections. So I think to answer the last piece of the question, yes, any fees that are active on abandoned records do have to be paid, and there will be consequences if those fees don't get paid. And that's why invoices have been generated for records that are abandoned that received a service from DCR.
Our next question comes from Joe C. We received a notice last Monday from DCR concerning outstanding fees that need to be paid before renewal can be submitted. We immediately emailed finance, but just received an automated response concerning appointment scheduling. How can we determine what we owe to finance?
So I'll break that down into a couple different steps. In order for a record to be eligible for renewal, the business has to be in good standing with the city. That includes being current on their business taxes, current on all permit fees, or fees due to other city agencies. We were notified by the Department of Water and Power, as well as the Office of Finance, that a number of the businesses that are subject to renewal obligations are not in good standing with their agencies. We have sent targeted communications to those businesses, letting them know that they need to notify either DWP, Finance, or both that they received the notice and they need to get information. DCR doesn't have access to DWP records or balances. We don't have access to Finance's system for taxpayer obligations or what your balances do. So all we can say is we've been notified by these agencies that you're not in good standing and provide you contact information to them. And then you have to go and follow up with those agencies. Those agencies will give us an updated list in December, which will kind of drive whether or not a renewal will be approved or potentially denied. The need to actually renew your record and submit your renewal and pay the fees through the portal has to be met by November 1st, or late fees would be applied. Your ability to submit your renewal record through the portal, you're not blocked if you owe other city agencies money. But once you submit the renewal and you pay the fees and we start working on it, if you haven't resolved those deficiencies with those agencies, DCR may deny your renewal. But if you got the letter, you don't have to get into good standing by November 1st to submit your renewal. Submit the renewal, follow up with those agencies, and then find out what it will take for you to get back into good standing. And please do that as soon as possible, because we will start to deny renewal records in December for folks that have not made an effort to outreach to those agencies and come back into good standing.
Our next question comes from Armin P. and Stephanie R. Annual license application invoices were sent with a due date of September 30th, 2024. New invoices were sent, which included the annual application fee and the license renewal fee on one invoice due on November 1st. Could you clarify the due dates and whether DCR is considering extending these payments?
So if you received an annual license application invoice with a due date of September 30th of 2024, those annual license application fees are due on or before September 30th. When you submit a renewal record, the renewal fees are assessed on your record, and that invoice is going to show any line item that has not been voided or been paid. So submitting a renewal is going to result in that renewal showing any of your annual license application invoice fees as well as your renewal fees. The renewal fees are due on or before November 1st, 2024, and those annual license applications for this example would be due on or before September 30th. There is no plan to extend the due dates, and failure to pay the fees may result in the abandonment of your record. And again, if a record ultimately is abandoned due to unpaid fees, it's not eligible for refiling, and those fees will still be due, and you could be sent to collections. And, if you haven't paid your annual license application fees, but you pay your renewal fees, your record is not going to be eligible for renewal because you still owe DCR money for the annual license application fee, and your renewal will probably be denied for those reasons.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from John D. Why are annual renewal licensing fees so high this year for non-retail? Last year, fees were relatively low, and DCR mentioned that it was going to stay that way.
So two pieces there. We migrated everybody out of the temporary approval application process in calendar year 2023 so that we could start issuing annual licenses in 2024. The state Department of Cannabis Control awarded the city of LA through the local jurisdiction assistance grant monies to help defray the cost of converting provisional licensees through the annual license process so that they can get their state annual license. DCR has been having, the fees last year were so low because it was assumed that the LJAG funds were going to be used to pay for a variety of fees that would offset the cost of your renewal. The DCC has indicated that a lot of those fees could be covered by the grant, but they're not going to allow the city to use those monies unless we retroactively disallow costs associated with staff members processing the Form 4013 forms, which would create a general fund deficit. So our legal team is now involved with the state's legal team trying to get this resolved. But effectively, we can't assume that the LJAG funds can be used to offset any portion of the fees, which is why the fees that are in the municipal code were assessed this year and nothing has been deferred. At this point, the grant term ends March 31st of 2025, and ultimately any of the deferred fees that can't be covered by the LJAG will be assessed to people's records. So the relief that you got in 2023 was intended to be one-time relief, and if the state doesn't make good on the use of the funds like they said they would, those fees could be assessed to you because, again, they're in a deferral state.
Our next question comes from Diana E. If the applicant has a record number ending with LIC, do they still need to pay a separate $7,691 fee for the annual license application, or only the $8,486 fee?
They would pay the 8486 per activity if they were assessed the renewal fee of 7691 because they hadn't received their LIC by the time the renewal period started and they paid the 7691. They would just have to pay the difference between the 8486 and the 7691 to renew their annual license for 2025.
Our next question comes from Joe C. And if you need me to repeat any parts of this, let me know, Jason. We received an email from DCR about a balance with Office of Finance on 10/7. They responded 11 days later. We went to the Office of Finance on Monday and was told they still have 600 plus emails to review. We have filed our renewal with DCR and will pay our renewal by the end of the week. I am concerned that the issue with the Office of Finance will not be resolved by 11/1. Is DCR working with the Office of Finance to find a solution, or potentially looking at a delay past 11/1 deadline with outstanding balances? Thank you.
So there's two parts. So the applicant got notice that they owed Office of Finance money. The applicant made a good faith effort to reach out to finance, and it sounds like they're in their queue to speak with somebody to figure out how to come back into good standing with finance. So when we get an updated list so the November 1st deadline is the deadline for the applicant or licensee to submit their renewal application and pay their fees to DCR. Their 2024 license is still valid through the end of the year. So we would not deny the renewal for next calendar year on November 1st. What we do is we wait until we get a list from finance in December that will be pared down from the 600 businesses that they're working with right now. And, we'll send out another communication to those folks to let them know, hey, your renewal application is pending. Finance has indicated that you're still not in good standing. Here's the period of time finance has provided for you to come back into good standing. And, finance may say that you've entered into a payment plan. They may say that you're going through an audit. They may give DCR a number of reasons which would allow for DCR to know that the applicant is in good standing because they're working with finance, and we take finance at their word on face value for that. And that would result in us granting the renewal if the business doesn't, stick with the payment plan. They renege on whatever, dealing that they had with finance, and they fall out of good standing. That could lead to the suspension or revocation of a license. Only the folks that don't come into good standing and finance has no record of them trying to come into good standing are at risk of being denied in early December. And most likely all of that would go into effect sometime in January after the license of the record naturally expires. So continue to work with finance. If you've submitted your renewal, you pay your fees. Your renewal application record will not be denied on December 1st. Staff will start working on it and reviewing it. And if you're still on the finance list, it'll be something that gets flagged, and you'll probably get follow-up communications from the city. And, the city will do its best to try to work with you while you work with these other agencies to try to resolve those issues. But if you haven't resolved those issues by the end of the calendar year, your license will expire and you'll have to cease operating until you come back into good standing.
Our next question comes from Coach R. How does one donate flour to the public?
I would the person asking the question is going to have to reach out to the Department of Cannabis Control um, and provide information about what license type they have and whether or not that it would even be allowed.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from John D. How do applicants know they are eligible for an annual license? For example, we received an annual license invoice for the renewal, but we weren't advised that we were transferred over to an annual. This is for non-retail.
If your record ends in LIC, so it has an LIC suffix, that means that you've completed the annual license application process and been issued an annual license. For businesses that have been going through the commission and they've been issued the Type 10, we processed your non-retail in parallel with that, included that in your environmental document that got filed with the county and OPR, so that you would also be eligible to get your non-retail licenses when you got your retail storefront license. For folks that are purely non-retail, we've started to do those conversions, and you should receive a notice of complete application. And because there's not a community meeting or a public hearing process associated with the non-retail, once you get your NOCA, it's normally a week or two before we finalize the staff report, and it gets reviewed by me. And then, if everything is in line, I sign off on it. And then the record goes to our document services group for filing. And then, once we get the paperwork back from the document services group and the appeal period has run on that activity type, the licensing staff will convert you over from an A&N record to the LIC record, at which point you'll have annual licenses. Since renewals are done through the Excella portal, the record itself, the system knows what fees to assess based on where the record is in the process. If you try to renew an A&N record and you have temporary approval, it'll assess the fee of $42.33. If you have an A&N record but you don't have temporary approval, the system will assess the $18.29 per activity. And then, of course, if you've migrated over to the annual license record and it ends in LIC, when you renew that record, the system will assess a fee of $84.86.
Thank you. Our next question from John D. If an entity wants to remove one of 3 license activities it currently holds under the same entity and submits a license cancellation form along with a modification request cover page, is the entity required to pay a modification fee? Are there any other fees involved in processing this change? And also, how long does this process take once the form is submitted?
The answer is yes. If you want to cancel a license, you'll have to submit paperwork to request that cancellation. Staff are going to have to review and process it. So you would be assessed the $542 fee. Assuming the paperwork is in order, that would be the only fee assessed if you are canceling an activity. Alternatively, as you go through your renewal for next calendar year, when you get to the activity page, you'll see, check marks for any of the activities that are on the record. You can uncheck an activity and, then that renewal for that activity will be removed from your record for calendar year 2025, and it will no longer appear beginning January 1st when we update your record. So do you allow for that activity to just expire and fall off naturally by unselecting it through the renewal process and just moving forward with check marks on the activities you want to renew? Or do you want to cancel that activity now before the end of the year? And then that would result in you paying the 542. There's two different ways to do it. One's going to incur a cost, one will incur no cost. It just depends on if they want to do it as part of a modification process or if they just want to drop the activities through the renewal process.
A question from Stephanie R. When submitting a modification request through the DCR portal for a license cancellation form, which type of record should we use? Should it be submitted under the legal business entity record, annual record, or application record?
It's going to have to be submitted on either the annual record if we've issued an annual license, or the application record if you still have a pending application for that activity.
Next question again from Stephanie. Licensee converted from a corporation to a limited liability company. The business name remains the same. Only the entity designation has changed. What is the process for updating the entity designation in the DCR portal? Are there any fees associated with this update? And what documentation, if any, is required for this to verify this change?
So the first step is going to be linking up with your analyst and then inquiring with the Office of Finance. So the Office of Finance is our taxation arm, and they issue the business tax registration certificates. So they'll look at the conversion that you did and determine whether or not the same BTRC number is going to be kept. Given the fact that those are two different entity types, my assumption is the Secretary of State has issued a new entity number for their purposes, and you may need to reapply or change your entity type or name with the Department of Cannabis Control, because you're not going to be able to operate under the new entity without both local licenses and state licenses associated with the new entity. Once we have an idea of how finance is going to treat the conversion and the Department of Cannabis Control is going to treat the conversion, it may be something where it's just a legal ownership, legal name change. And, there's a set of fees associated with the legal name change. Or it may be considered an entity substitution, and a new application will have to be filed under the new entity, and applicable fees will have to be paid. But just based on the limited information I have, I can't determine whether or not it can be processed as a legal business name change, or if it's going to have to be processed as an entity substitution. So please reach out to your analyst and provide them the information, and then we can start linking up with the Office of Finance and the Department of Cannabis Control to understand how those agencies are going to process this conversion, because that will kind of greatly determine whether it's a legal entity name change or entity substitution.
An additional question from Stephanie R. To update contacts on the license, can this be done with a modification request submitted in conjunction with another mod? Is it still the same 542 fee to update?
It depends on the contacts that you're trying to change. For owners and primary personnel, there's a modification fee associated with those types of changes. Those mods get submitted against the legal business entity record, And then we have to get new forms and documents to review and then align the contacts on the record with whatever the new org chart is or the primary personnel in their roles. For like a neighborhood liaison, a consultant, a law firm, the record specific contact types, those can be submitted either on the annual record or the application record. And to the extent that hypothetically you're changing your neighborhood liaison, that would not trigger a fee. You just have to make sure you enter the information um, through the portal. And then once the mod comes through, you should not be assessed a 542 fee or anything else, because really it's the applicant or licensee's choice of who they want their neighborhood liaison to be. And once they submit the mod, we can go ahead and process it so the contact gets updated on that record. Um, the general rule is contact types that are like record specific, neighborhood liaisons, consultants, etc. There is no fee to change it on the application or license record. However, if you're making modifications to the legal business entity owners, primary personnel, adding authorized agents, that would trigger additional fees.
Um, one more from Stephanie R. Is there any way we could get notice on who the licensing analyst is for a company? Can it be listed in Excella?
It's the easiest way to find out is to email dcrlicensing@lacity.org, and our customer care team will either route your inquiry directly to your analyst, or they'll be able to provide that analyst's contact information so you can interact with them directly. We are working with Excella to make that information available, but the Excella Citizen Access only has a certain number of like default um, fields that can be displayed publicly. And since the licensing analyst field is a custom field, it can't be displayed. So we're working with the Excella team to see if we can repurpose a different field that's part of their base software package and then have that information copied in that field so it could be made publicly available. We did something similar with the social equity individual applicant verification statuses. We repurposed like birthplace state, and another field so that we could display it. So we're investigating what type of fields we could repurpose from the base solution to copy over that information to and make it available. It's not the highest of my priorities, but it's something I expect to roll out sometime in 2025.
Our next question comes from Armin P. If a Phase 1 applicant who has already received an operating permit from DCR and a certificate of occupancy from LADBS applies for entity substitution through modification, does the new entity need to obtain a new operating permit? If so, does the new entity need to apply for a new certificate of occupancy from LADBS?
Any entity substitution does require a new application for that application to get processed in accordance with the municipal code and the rules and regulations. So if you do an entity substitution, the new entity will have to demonstrate it can meet all of the application requirements and be issued an annual license in its name. And then once the annual license has been issued in its name, you'll have to get your health permit and any of your other operating permits in the name of the entity. For the certificate of occupancy, it's tied to the use and what's recorded on the building permit. For the certificate of occupancy, if it's been updated from warehouse to retail, then that certificate of occupancy should stick to the building. It's not entity specific. So you shouldn't have to get a new certificate of occupancy when you do an entity substitution. But fire permits, police permits, health permits, you'll have to get all of those reissued in the name of the new entity.
Thanks, Jason. Our next question comes from Kristen K. If the licensee has already received the notice of complete application, at what point is the best time to submit an ownership modification?
Um, if it's just like a traditional ownership modification, those can be submitted against the legal business entity record at any time. There are certain types of ownership modifications that can't be processed until a license has been issued, such as a phase three retail round one application. The social equity individual applicant who is granted the opportunity to apply cannot be removed until a license has been issued. So if you're trying to remove somebody before a social equity individual applicant before a license is issued, we won't be able to process it until a license is issued. If you're trying to change financial interest holders or you're moving equity between existing owners on the record, you can submit that mod against the legal business entity record. And then once that mod has been processed, we would be able to move forward with continuing to process your annual license application. Kind of mechanically, the code gives DCR the ability to suspend processing of an annual license application when we need additional forms, documents, and information from the applicant. If you receive the notice of complete application and then you submit a modification to change the ownership on the entity, that's going to suspend processing of that application until the modification has been resolved. So submitting a modification after you received your notice of complete application, but before you're granted an annual license, will suspend processing until the mod gets completed. And then we will pick up we'll continue processing the annual application. For a lot of folks, they just opt to wait until we make a determination to issue an annual license before they submit the ownership modification to not slow down the processing of their annual license application. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Jason. This is an additional question from Kristen. Can the licensee submit an ownership modification prior to applying for its operating permit?
Yes. So, once a license is issued, applicants are able to make all kinds of ownership modification requests. The annual license gets issued before an operating permit can even be requested. And, once you have that annual license, you can submit the modification request. And assuming that it's not changing the entity or requiring us to go through a new equity share review, it shouldn't slow you down in your ability to pursue an operating permit and, get your health permits, et cetera, because those other agencies aren't worried about the ownership of the applicant. They just want to make sure that the applicant or licensee has the necessary permits. And then once you have all of your permits and you can demonstrate that your certificate of occupancy aligns with the activity, you would be able to request a final inspection. And then if you pass the final inspection, you get your operating permit.
Question from Michael R. Is it possible to submit any modifications to our license alongside the renewal, or must we first complete the renewal process before submitting a mod request?
The only thing you can do as part of the renewal process is choose not to renew specific activities by deselecting them during the renewal record intake. For all other modification types that tie to an application or license record, you'll have to submit your renewal first and then submit your modification request. And then those two requests will be processed in parallel with one another. And, you maintain the status quo on the record through the renewal process. And then if the modification is approved, those changes will be applied on a go forward basis whenever the mod gets approved. For changes in ownership and stuff like that, or primary personnel, those have to be submitted through the legal business entity record. And those modifications are accepted pretty much year round and can be done without impacting your application or license renewal because they're separate records.
Question from Jorge T. I'm a Phase 3 Round 1 applicant whose application has an abandoned refile status. Is any action required for the December 31st license renewal deadline?
If you have outstanding fees, such as your annual license application fee that have not been paid, those need to be paid. If your balance is not zero, you will not be eligible to refile. And since you don't have a pending application or license before the department, you don't have to submit a renewal record, but you do just need to make sure that any balances owed to the department are timely paid so that your balance can be zeroed out and you don't run the risk of, um, you know, having your debt written off and being sent to collections.
A follow-up question from Jorge T. I understand that some changes were made to the application procedures with new regulations that came out in June. But are applicants still able to file pre-application as a sole proprietorship and convert to an LLC when submitting a temporary approval or annual license?
No, you have to complete the pre-app the way you want the application to be submitted.
Next question from Stephanie R. Will annual licensing fees be every year in addition to the renewal fee, or is it a one-time payment?
The application fees are, one-time fees. Renewal fees are annual. Businesses that, convert from being an applicant to an annual license holder will have their renewal fees change based on the record status. Same thing for folks that go from being, a temporary approval holder to an annual license holder. Your renewal fee amounts will change, but you don't have to reapply for the activity every single year, separate from the renewal process. The annual license application fees are one time tied to DCR processing the annual license application. If a license is issued or that record needs to be renewed, you pay renewal fees based on the record status, but you don't have to repay new annual licensing application fees.
Our next question, again from Stephanie. Are there any updates on new social equity verification with DCR?
DCR is pursuing an amendment to the equity share criteria for a few reasons, but one of those reasons is to make it easier to complete the equity share review by allowing us to use a broader range of documentation to satisfy it, and then focusing on some of the different caveats for where people actually live to make the analysis easier. And those changes should be transmitted in the next couple of weeks, and hopefully the city council will vote favorably on those. And if that's the case, we'll plan to do a verification process in 2025. But there is no plan to do another verification process based on the criteria that's currently in the municipal code.
Thanks, Jason. And I think we have time for a couple more questions. This one comes from Stephanie R. I want to remove a licensed activity from a license. I was able to submit my renewal by removing the activity being dissolved, but no invoice was generated. The only invoice still on the portal is outdated. How do I go about getting a new invoice, or can I use this Sorry, let me try that again. Can I use this invoice and only pay for 2/3 of the activities?
if you go to the Office of Finance or you mail in the payment to the Office of Finance, you could pay for the two out of the three activities that you want to renew. Um, if you do that, please make sure to indicate on, if you mail in the payment, what two activities are being renewed because finance processes those payments. And then that's how it gets reported back to us. Um, if you go to finance, you know, they can always call our payment processing team to verify what you're trying to do, if you're there in person. And then the last piece is if you reach out to your analyst, they can go ahead and verify that the renewal record accurately reflects the removal of a given activity. And then they can reissue a new invoice with the November 1st date. But there's nothing, if you already have an invoice, there's nothing that would prevent you from, just paying the two out of the three activities that you want to renew. Just make it clear to finance which activities are being renewed and which one is going to expire.
I think we have time for one more question. Excuse me, from George B. Is there hardship assistance for licensees?
No, there's no hardship assistance for licensees from DCR fees.
Do you have time for one more, Jason, or do you need to wrap it up?
Sure. I have a hard stop at 1, but until
Okay.
1, I can answer as many questions as you get me.
Okay. This one comes from Portia W. When will the retail license open up again?
To the extent that there's going to be another round of retail storefront, the Type 10 activity, that would be conducted through a lottery. At this time, we don't have a vendor or anybody set up to do another lottery. We are hopeful that the equity share criteria gets amended. We do another verification in 2025, and then we would look to do a lottery once that's all complete.
One last question from Armin K. Why do we pay annual and temporary fees simultaneously?
The annual license application fees were deferred, and the Department of Cannabis Control notified DCR that we cannot use LJAG funds to waive those fees. So the annual license application fees, which would have been due within 30 days of submitting the annual license application, have been deferred. And those fees are due to cover the cost of DCR staff processing the annual license applications. And then separately, either your temporary approval or your annual license renewal fees are due on an annual basis. It's just unfortunate that this year we have, people paying deferred fees to even get into the process to be able to have a license to operate, running in parallel with our standard annual renewal process. And, that unfortunately comes back to the Department of Cannabis Control and their not timely processing our amendment request or getting back to us for an amendment process that was submitted in April of 2023 that is still not resolved.
Thank you, Jason. I think we're done.
Thank you. Our next Q&A session is going to be, I believe, on November 20th, and that will be the last one for this calendar year. I'm assuming we didn't get through all of the questions that were previously submitted, so if we could just carry those over and have them be first on the next meeting, I would appreciate it.
Will do.
And I appreciate everybody participating in today's Q&A session. And I hope everybody has a great day, and I will talk to everybody soon. Thank you. Bye.